In 1942, 30-year-old Frances Farmer was Hollywood's most defiant actress. She had starred in films alongside Cary Grant and Bing Crosby, and the studios were calling her the next big thing, even as they were quietly terrified of her refusal to play by their rules. Then, her mother had her committed to a psychiatric hospital against her will. Frances spent the next 7 years locked inside institutions where the treatments were brutal and the staff was utterly indifferent to her, screaming that she didn't belong there. When she was finally released in 1950, she couldn't remember large portions of her life, including some of the films she had made and the people she had worked with. Hollywood, which had once promised her stardom, never spoke her name again. But what happened to Frances inside those hospitals, what the doctors did to her with her mother's permission, and why the state allowed it to continue for years, was something that wasn't supposed to come out until long after everyone involved was dead. And when it finally did, the world was horrified. Frances Elena Farmer was born in Seattle, Washington, in 1913 to a mother who was deeply religious and a father who was a lawyer with a drinking problem. The household was tense from the beginning. Her mother, Lillian, was controlling in a way that went far beyond typical parenting, dictating what Frances could wear, who she could see, what she could read, and how she should behave at all times. Frances, who was fiercely intelligent and deeply stubborn, pushed back constantly. In high school, she wrote an essay titled "God Dies" that won a local contest and caused a scandal in her deeply Christian community. Her mother was mortified. The neighbors were outraged. Frances didn't care. She had discovered that saying things people didn't want to hear gave her a sense of power in a household where she had almost none. And she leaned into it with a determination that worried everyone around her. She won a scholarship to the University of Washington and studied journalism and drama. And it was there that she discovered acting. She was good at it in a way that surprised even her. And when she won a trip to the Soviet Union as part of a college competition in 1935, she took it despite her mother's protests that it would ruin her reputation. The trip made national headlines. A beautiful young American woman visiting Stalin's Russia at the height of the Red Scare was not something Middle America was prepared to approve of. And Frances didn't particularly care about that either. When she returned, she was offered a contract with Paramount Pictures. She was 22 years old, and Hollywood was hers if she wanted it. She wanted it, but she wanted it on her own terms, and that was where the trouble began. Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood in 1936 and immediately made enemies. She refused to do publicity shoots she found demeaning. She skipped premieres. She gave interviews where she criticized the studio system and called out the hypocrisy of the men running it. Paramount didn't know what to do with her. She was talented and beautiful, and audiences liked her. But she was also utterly unmanageable in a way that terrified executives who were used to actors doing exactly what they were told. Her first major role was opposite in Bing Crosby in Rhythm on the Range, and she was good enough that Paramount immediately cast her in bigger films. Come and Get It, The Toast of New York. She was working constantly and getting better with each role, and the reviews were strong. But behind the scenes, she was drinking heavily and fighting with directors and showing up late to set, and the studio's patience was wearing dangerously thin. In 1937, she began a relationship with playwright Clifford Odets that was passionate and deeply turbulent. They fought constantly. He was possessive, she was defiant. The relationship collapsed within a year, and Frances responded by throwing herself even harder into work and drinking and pushing every boundary the studio tried to set. By 1939, Paramount had had enough. They dropped her contract. She tried to keep working. She appeared in a few independent films. She did some stage work. But Hollywood had decided she was difficult. And once that reputation took hold, it was nearly impossible to shake. By 1942, she was 30 years old, and her career was essentially over. And she was broke and drinking heavily, and her mother Lillian, who had never stopped trying to control her daughter's life from 2,000 miles away in Seattle, decided it was time to intervene. In January 1943, Frances Farmer was arrested for driving with a suspended license. It was a minor offense. But when she appeared in court, she was combative and openly contemptuous of the judge, and he ordered a psychiatric evaluation. Her mother saw an opportunity. Lillian Farmer had spent years watching her daughter defy her, embarrass her, reject everything she had tried to teach her about proper behavior and respectability. Now, the courts were giving her a way to fix it. She signed the papers to have Frances committed to a psychiatric hospital, and on March 24, 1943, Frances was taken to the Kimball Sanitarium in La Crescenta, California, against her will. She was not insane. She was angry and alcoholic and deeply depressed about the collapse of her career, but she was not mentally ill in any clinical sense. That didn't matter. The diagnosis was manic depressive psychosis. And once the papers were signed, Frances Farmer had almost no legal rights left. Her mother became her legal guardian. The doctors could do whatever they wanted. And Frances, who had spent her entire life refusing to be controlled, found herself in a situation where control was the only thing that mattered, and she had absolutely none of it. She spent a few months at private hospitals before the money ran out, and then her mother had her transferred to Western State Hospital in Washington, a public psychiatric institution that was overcrowded and underfunded and brutal. Frances arrived there in 1944. She would spend the next 6 years inside. Western State Hospital in the 1940s was a nightmare. Patients were kept in overcrowded wards with minimal supervision. The treatments were experimental at best and sadistic at worst. Insulin shock therapy, hydrotherapy where patients were submerged in ice baths for hours, straitjackets, isolation cells. And for patients who were considered particularly difficult, there was one treatment that doctors had recently begun using with alarming frequency: transorbital lobotomy. Whether Frances Farmer received a lobotomy has been debated for decades. Her medical records from Western State were destroyed years before anyone thought to look for them, and the hospital itself was notoriously lax about documenting procedures. But multiple staff members who worked there in the 1940s later said they remembered her, and they remembered that she had been lobotomized. And the description they gave of her condition when she was released in 1950 matched exactly what you would expect from someone who had undergone the procedure. She was released in March 1950 after 7 years inside. Her mother signed the discharge papers. Frances was 36 years old, and she was not the same person who had gone in. She was quiet, compliant. Her memory had significant gaps. She couldn't remember some of her films. She couldn't remember people she had worked with. Her personality, the fierce, defiant intelligence that had defined her entire life, was gone. Frances tried to rebuild her life. She worked as a hotel clerk. She did some local television in Indianapolis. She appeared on This Is Your Life in 1958, a show where they surprised guests with people from their past. And she sat there looking utterly bewildered as former co-stars talked about films she could barely remember making. The host kept asking her cheerful questions about her Hollywood career, and she kept giving short to vague answers. And anyone watching could see that something was very wrong. Hollywood never called, not once. The studio that had once fought to cast her, the directors who had praised her talent, the actors who had worked alongside her, they all stayed silent. Frances Farmer had been difficult, and Hollywood didn't forgive difficult. And the fact that she had spent 7 years locked in an asylum, being subjected to treatments that had destroyed her ability to function normally, was not something anyone felt compelled to address publicly. She married 3 times after her release. None of the marriages lasted. She drank. She worked whatever job she could find. She gave a few interviews where she spoke carefully and vaguely about her time in the hospital, never quite saying what had been done to her, but making it clear through her pauses and her silences that it had been bad, very bad. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked the hard questions. Nobody wanted to know. Frances Farmer died in August 1970 from esophageal cancer. She was 56 years old. Her obituary in the New York Times was 6 paragraphs long and spent most of its space describing her early career and her troubles with Hollywood before briefly mentioning that she had been hospitalized for mental illness. It did not mention the 7 years at Western State. It did not mention what had been done to her there. It described her later life as quiet. In 1978, 8 years after her death, a journalist named William Arnold published a biography called Shadowland that detailed what had happened to Frances at Western State Hospital. The book included a testimony from former staff members who described the lobotomy, the abuse, the conditions that were so horrific that multiple employees had quit rather than continue working there. The revelations caused a scandal. The state of Washington launched an investigation into Western State's practices in the 1940s. Lawsuits were filed by families of other former patients. The hospital's medical practices were completely overhauled. But Frances Farmer was dead. Her mother Lillian, who had signed the commitment papers and kept her daughter locked away for 7 years, had died in 1955 without ever publicly acknowledging what she had done. The doctors who performed for the procedures were retired or dead. Hollywood, which had once promised Frances stardom and then abandoned her the moment she became inconvenient, said nothing at all. If this story made you angry, a thumbs up helps more people find it. Subscribe for more stories about the people Hollywood destroyed and then pretended to forget, because Frances Farmer was very far from the only one.